The knife stopped midair over the onions when the door chimed too hard, like someone wanted me to hear it coming. I didn't look up right away. In a diner during the lunch rush, you learn to read a room through sound before you ever turn around, and what I heard was wrong. 3 sets of footsteps, not the shuffle of regulars. Expensive shoes on a floor that had never once needed to sound expensive. My son, Mateo, was in the back booth with his math homework spread out like it always was on Tuesdays, and some instinct in me moved before my brain caught up, angling my body so I could see him without seeming to. Then I saw the man in front, and I understood why the room had gone quiet. He wasn't loud. That was the strange part. He didn't need to be. He walked through my diner like he already owned the air in it, 2 men trailing him with the kind of stillness that isn't calm, it's controlled. He stopped at the counter and looked around the way you'd look at a used car you were deciding whether to lowball. I wiped my hands on my apron and walked over, because it was my counter and nobody gets to stand at it like they're doing inventory without me being part of the conversation. "Can I help you?" I said. Not a question, really. "We're evaluating the property," he said, like that explained anything, like I was furniture that happened to have ears. He glanced at the ceiling, at the wiring, at the booth where my son was sitting, and something in his face didn't like what it saw there, though I couldn't tell if it was disgust or something closer to inconvenience. Evaluating it for what? That's not really something I need to discuss with staff. The word staff landed in my own diner like a slap, and I felt Rosa, my best server, freeze behind the counter with a coffee pot still tilted mid-pour. I straightened up. "I don't work here," I said. "I built this place. Every table, every recipe, every name on that payroll you clearly haven't looked at. So if you're evaluating something, you can evaluate it with me, because I'm the only person in this room with the authority to talk to you about it." That should have been the moment he adjusted. Instead, something in his jaw tightened, like my correcting him had cost him something he didn't like losing in front of his own men. "Then let me save us both some time," he said. "This block is being redeveloped. Whatever sentimental value this place has to you, understand that it holds none in the actual numbers. A diner like this isn't going to survive what's coming. It's worthless in the context of what this street is about to become." I heard someone's fork stop against a plate. I heard Mateo's pencil go still. I could have felt small in that moment. I'd felt small before, plenty of times, in rooms with men who talked like the world belonged to them by default. But something had changed in me since the last time a man decided my life was his to appraise, and I didn't bend the way I used to. "You didn't ask me one question about this business," I said, low enough that it was just for him. "Not one. You didn't ask how long we've been open, how many families eat here every week, whether we turn a profit. You already decided what this place was worth before you walked through that door, because deciding for people is easier than talking to them. That's not evaluation. That's cowardice wearing a suit." For a second, just a second, he didn't have anything to say back. I watched it land somewhere under the surface of him, somewhere he didn't let people see often. Then he recovered, nodded once like the conversation was beneath finishing, and turned to leave, his men falling in step behind him like they'd rehearsed it. But on his way out, his eyes caught on something behind my counter, low on the shelf where I kept the old paperwork I never had the heart to throw away. An old lease document, yellowed at the corners, tucked between a coffee filter box and a stack of takeout menus. He looked at it a half second too long for it to mean nothing. Then he was gone, and the door chimed again, softer this time, like even the bell knew the moment was over. Rosa exhaled like she'd been holding her breath since he walked in. Mateo came up beside me, quiet, the way he got when he knew something serious had happened but didn't have the words for it yet. "Who is that?" he asked. "Someone who's about to find out he was wrong about something," I said. And I meant it, though I didn't yet know how right I was. Because as his car pulled away from the curb, I stood at the window and realized what had actually bothered me about the whole exchange. He hadn't asked me a single real question about my business. Not one. But he'd looked at that lease like he already knew something about it that I didn't. If you know exactly what it feels like to have a man walk into your life and decide your worth before he's earned the right to an opinion, do me a favor and subscribe right now, because this is the story of what happened when I refused to let him be right. He came back 3 days later, alone this time. No entourage, no expensive shoes doing their choreography behind him. Just him, standing at my counter during the slow hour between lunch and dinner, holding an envelope like it was something he didn't want to be carrying. "Formal notice," he said, sliding it across the counter. "On the redevelopment timeline. Your lease has protections, but they're not unlimited." I didn't open it right away. I looked at him instead, at the way he stood like he was bracing for a fight he expected to win easily. "I'm not signing an early termination," I said. "Whatever this is asking for, the answer's no. You haven't read it. I don't need to. I know what men like you ask for when you show up with an envelope instead of a conversation." Something flickered across his face, not quite surprise, more like recalibration. I watched him actually look at my diner for the first time, not as a line item, but as a place. He noticed the way Rosa moved between tables without needing to be told where to go. He noticed the chalkboard specials written in Mateo's careful, 7-year-old handwriting, because I'd let him do the M and W's since he loved how they looked like little mountains. He noticed, I think, that nothing here was falling apart the way he'd assumed it would be. "You run this efficiently," he said, like it cost him something to admit it. "I run it like it's mine, because it is." His eyes drifted, almost against his will, to the shelf behind me, to that same old lease document from before. "That document," he said, "the founding lease. What does the clause on page 3 actually cover?" I felt my spine go straight. "How do you know there's a clause on page 3? "I don't. I am asking." I didn't answer right away because the truth was I didn't fully know either. It had come with the property when I signed my own lease years ago, some legacy language from the original owner that my lawyer had glossed over as boilerplate. I'd never had a reason to dig into it. "It's old paperwork," I said carefully. "Older than my time here. I don't see why it matters to a redevelopment deal." "It might not," he said, too quickly for it to be nothing. For the first time since he'd walked into my life, I watched him hesitate, like he was standing at the edge of saying more than he meant to. Then he caught himself doing it, and I caught him catching himself. And something passed between us that had nothing to do with property values. "You're staring," I said. He blinked, like I'd interrupted something. "I'm not. You were. It's fine. I get a lot from men who expect me to fold and are confused when I don't." That landed somewhere unexpected. I saw the corner of his mouth do something that wasn't quite a smile, more like the memory of one. He left without the document. He left, in fact, without asking for anything at all, which I would come to understand later was the strangest thing he'd done in 18 months. If a man corners your business one week and can't stop looking at your paperwork the next, comment below and tell me whether you trust him or watch your back twice as hard, because I genuinely didn't know which one I was supposed to do. His name, I learned later from someone who wasn't supposed to tell me, was Damian Cross. And 2 nights after that second visit, in an office across town that I would never see but could imagine well enough from what came after, Damian sat across from the man he trusted more than anyone left in his life. Victor had been at his side for years. Older, warmer somehow, the kind of presence that made a room feel less dangerous just by being in it, which was exactly why Damian let his guard down around him in ways he didn't around anyone else. 18 months earlier, someone else entirely had used a fabricated story, a manufactured tragedy, to manipulate Damian into a deal that nearly got his men killed. Since then, Damian trusted almost no one. Victor was the exception. Victor was supposed to be the one person who'd never lied to him. That lease clause, Victor said, refilling Damian's glass without being asked. "You should push the timeline up. If that old language gets discovered by the wrong lawyer, it could stall the whole redevelopment for months. It's one line in an outdated contract. It's one line that could cost you the entire block if someone smarter than her figures out what it means first." Damian didn't know, could have known, that Victor's urgency wasn't protection. It was self-preservation. That clause traced back to a fraud Victor himself had committed years before Damian ever rose to lead anything, a fraud that would unravel everything Victor had built his position on top of if it ever saw daylight. Meanwhile, back at the diner, a man in a city uniform walked through my door with a clipboard and a face like he already knew the answer to whatever he was about to ask. "Health code violation," he said. "Anonymous complaint. I need to inspect your kitchen." I hadn't called for any inspection. Nobody had told me one was coming. And when he started citing infractions that didn't exist, violations for equipment I didn't even own, I felt something cold slide down my spine that had nothing to do with the walk-in freezer door standing open behind him. I called Damien the second the inspector left, my hands shaking so hard I almost couldn't hold the phone steady. "If this is you," I said before he'd even finished saying hello, "if this is some kind of pressure tactic to force me out of that lease, I want you to know it's not going to work. I will fight you in every courtroom this city has." There was a pause on the other end, long enough that I almost thought the call had dropped. "I didn't send anyone," he said, and something in his voice sounded genuinely thrown, not defensive the way a liar sounds defensive, but confused, like I'd told him something impossible. "Give me 24 hours. I didn't believe him. Not yet. I'd spent 3 years being told by men that a woman running a place like mine alone wouldn't last, and I wasn't about to hand my trust to the first one who sounded sincere on a phone call. If you already suspect this wasn't coming from him either, hit that like button right now, because I promise you, figuring out who was actually pulling the strings took both of us a lot longer than it should have. And trust me when I tell you, that inspector wasn't the last uninvited visitor either one of us was about to get. Stay with me, because it gets a lot worse before anything gets honest. Damien showed up in person the next afternoon, which surprised me more than anything he could have said on the phone. He didn't send an assistant. He didn't send a lawyer. He walked in himself, carrying a folder, and set it on my counter like it was something fragile. "The inspection report," he said. "It was filed under my company's letterhead. Someone forged the authorization. I didn't order it, and I want you to see exactly why I know that." He walked me through it page by page, the mismatched signature, the timestamp that didn't align with anyone on his staff schedule, the citation codes that didn't even exist in this city's actual health ordinance. He wasn't performing innocence. He was building a case, methodically, like a man who'd learned the hard way that his word alone wasn't going to be enough for someone who had every reason not to trust him. Mateo wandered up from the back booth mid-explanation, drawn by curiosity the way 7-year-olds always are. "Are you the guy who called my mom worthless?" he asked, completely without malice. Just a kid asking a direct question because nobody had told him yet that adults usually dodge those. I watched Damien's face do something complicated. He could have deflected. He could have said something vague and adult-sounding to get past the moment. Instead, he crouched slightly, so he was closer to Mateo's eye level, and said, "Yeah, I did. I was wrong, and I'm working on fixing it." It wasn't a big moment. It wasn't dramatic, but it did more to crack something open in me than any apology aimed directly at me could have. That crack didn't last long, though, because 2 days later, I opened my supplier invoices and found half of them canceled without explanation. My produced contract gone, my meat supplier gone, both bought out from under me by a shell company I'd never heard of, cutting off my ingredient pipeline overnight. I printed the paperwork and drove straight to the address on Damien's card, and when I found him, I didn't say hello. I just held it up. "Is this your name on it too?" I asked. He looked at it for a long moment, and I watched something behind his eyes go very still. This is the moment his whole defense should have fallen apart. And honestly, I thought it had, so if you know someone who needs to see a man get caught trying to actually be decent for once, send them this story right now, because what happened next changed everything I thought I understood about him. "It's not mine," he said finally, "but I recognize the structure. I've seen a shell company built exactly like this before." He didn't say from who. Not yet. But I watched something shift behind his eyes, some private horror settling in that had nothing to do with me and everything to do with a name he wasn't ready to say out loud. What he didn't tell me that day was the full weight of what he'd recognized. The filing pattern matched something from years earlier, something tied to the betrayal that had made him so guarded in the first place. He was staring down the possibility that he was about to repeat the exact mistake that once nearly got his men killed. And this time, the person paying for it might be me. He didn't confront anyone yet. He didn't tell me everything. Instead, quietly, without asking for credit, he arranged backup supply lines through a contact of his own, legitimate distributors who could get me through the gap while he figured out what was actually happening. I didn't find out until days later, when a shipment arrived with no company name printed anywhere on the paperwork, just a single handwritten initial in the corner. D. Meanwhile, cut off from my usual suppliers, I did something I'd avoided doing for 3 years. I posted in the neighborhood group asking if anyone knew a local farm that could get me through the week. It wasn't dangerous. It wasn't dramatic. It was just humbling, having to ask after telling myself for so long that I didn't need anyone's help to keep this place standing. People showed up anyway. That was its own kind of lesson. But it was that single handwritten initial that undid something in me that 3 years of proving myself hadn't managed to touch. Not because he'd saved me, because he hadn't needed me to know it was him at all. If a man helped you and didn't need the credit for it, would that be the thing that finally cracked your guard down? Or is it too little too late for you? Tell me in the comments, because for me, it was the beginning of something I wasn't ready for yet. And if you want to see this version of him fully unravel, subscribe now, because it only gets more complicated from here. The break-in happened on a Tuesday night after close. I found out the next morning, walking into a kitchen that had been gone through with a precision that made my stomach turn. Nothing was smashed. Nothing was stolen, not really. Instead, someone had planted things. Cash in an envelope taped under a shelf. Documents that looked, at a glance, like they connected my diner to something illegal I had never touched in my life. It wasn't a robbery. It was a setup, timed and staged to make me look guilty of something the second anyone came looking. Damien arrived before I'd even finished calling it in, like he'd been waiting for exactly this kind of call. "This isn't the redevelopment deal," he said, standing in my ruined kitchen. And for the first time since I'd met him, his voice had none of that controlled distance in it. "This is coming from inside my own organization. I should have told you that sooner. I didn't want to believe it myself. I could have walked away right then. Every instinct that had kept me safe for years told me to protect myself and my son from whatever war was clearly circling this man's life. Instead, I found myself asking a different question. Then let's find out who," I said. We spent the rest of that night at the counter, sorting through everything, cross-referencing shipment dates and filing patterns until the sky outside started turning gray. It wasn't romantic, not in the way people usually mean that word. It was exhausted and quiet and ordinary. Two people who'd been awake too long, working toward the same answer. As the sun came up, I asked him a question I could tell he'd been dreading. "Who do you think did this?" He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said a name I'd never heard before. "Victor." He just said the name he's been protecting for 18 months. And honestly, if you saw that coming before I did, go ahead and like this video right now, because naming him was the easy part. Proving it was about to break everything apart. So stay with me, because we hadn't even found the worst of it yet. The lease clause turned out to be the answer neither of us expected. We went through it together, line by line, until we found the buried reference. A property fraud from years earlier, tied to the exact filing structure Victor had used against me. Except this fraud predated my ownership entirely. It traced back to before Damien had ever taken control of his organization, back to the moment Victor helped install him in the position he now held. I watched something break in Damien's face as the realization landed. The man he trusted more than anyone hadn't just betrayed him recently. Victor had engineered Damien's entire rise to power in the first place, manufacturing the very crisis that put Damien in charge, so that he'd always have someone he could quietly control from the shadows. "He built my whole career," Damien said, staring at the document like it might rearrange itself into something less true. "Every step of it. I thought I earned my place. I didn't offer comfort, not the soft kind he probably expected. Instead, I just watched him hold himself together, methodical, focused, already thinking 3 steps ahead toward how to fix it instead of collapsing under the weight of it. And something about that steadiness made me respect him more than any apology ever could have." The fallout came fast. Victor, sensing the document had surfaced, moved to protect himself the only way he knew how, quietly turning Damien's own men against him, questioning his judgment, his loyalty, planting doubt before Damien could expose the truth first. A call came in while we were still sitting there. 3 of Damien's most trusted men had requested a private meeting with Victor. Without him, if Victor manages to turn his own men against him before the truth even gets out, does Damien even have a way back from that? Comment below and tell me what you think happens next, because I genuinely didn't know if we'd gotten to him in time. Damien didn't respond with force. That surprised me more than almost anything else about him. Instead, he called his own meeting open in front of everyone and brought the lease document, the financial records, the falsified inspection report, and my own account of everything that had happened, laying it all out in one room with Victor sitting right there. I watched him dismantle a man's entire credibility using nothing but evidence and a voice that never once rose above steady. It wasn't the kind of showdown I expected from a world like his. It was quieter than that, and somehow more devastating. Victor, cornered, tried one last move. He turned toward me in front of the entire room and suggested, loudly enough for everyone to hear, that I'd use my body and my sympathy story to worm my way into Damien's inner circle to save my failing business. The old me might have frozen. The woman who first stood behind that counter and got called worthless might have shrunk under all those eyes. But I wasn't her anymore. I stood, and I answered him without raising my voice, laying out exactly how absurd it was to suggest a woman defending her own business from sabotage was somehow the manipulator in the room. I watched the sympathy in that room turn fully against him, not because Damien defended me, but because I didn't need him to. Damien watched me hold my ground in his world exactly the way I had in mine, and I saw something settle in him completely, like the last piece of doubt he'd been carrying finally let go. She just out-argued a mafia lieutenant in his own boardroom without raising her voice once. And if that doesn't earn a share from you, wait until you hear what Victor said on his way out the door, because he wasn't finished yet. One more chapter stands between this story ending in a threat kept, or a threat that finally has nowhere left to land. So subscribe now, because you're going to want to see how this actually ends. Victor's last move wasn't violence. It was worse in its own quiet way. Within days, doctored financial records started circulating anonymously, suggesting my diner had been a front for laundering money tied to the original fraud. It didn't matter that none of it was true. In my own neighborhood, among people who'd eaten at my counter for years, the accusation alone was enough to make people whisper. This was the lowest point, not a physical threat, not even a legal one I couldn't eventually fight, but the exact wound I'd carried since the day I opened this place. The fear that no matter how hard I worked, someone would always be ready to say I didn't belong here, that a woman running something alone was destined to be proven wrong eventually. Damien didn't swoop in and handle it for me. He mobilized his legal and financial resources, real ones, legitimate ones, and worked beside me instead of in front of me, making sure every decision about my own name and my own business stayed mine to make. Mateo came home from school upset one afternoon, having overheard kids repeating rumors their parents had been saying at dinner tables. I sat with him at our kitchen table, not Damien, me, and explained as much as a 7-year-old needed to understand that sometimes people say untrue things when they're scared, and that the truth takes a little longer, but it always catches up. Later that night, finalizing the public rebuttal statement with Damien at my counter, he asked me something that had nothing to do with the crisis at all. Once this is over, he said, would you ever consider a life that includes me? Permanently. He picked the middle of a crisis to ask about forever. And honestly, comment below whether you think I made him wait or said yes right there, because I'll tell you exactly what happened in the ending. Victor was formally removed from Damien's organization through legal and internal channels, exposed by his own paper trail. No violence necessary. No dramatic confrontation beyond the truth, simply outrunning him. Damien didn't just cancel the redevelopment deal as some kind of apology gesture. He offered me something with real weight behind it, legal equity partnership in the redeveloped block itself, making sure my diner wasn't just spared, but built permanently into the foundation of whatever came next for that street. A few weeks later, he sat at my kitchen table for dinner, across from Mateo, arguing cheerfully about whether pineapple belonged on pizza, like it was the most important debate in the world. No proposal, no dramatic declaration, just an ordinary Tuesday that felt, somehow, like the truest kind of permanence there was. When I finally signed the partnership papers, I looked up at him and said the only thing that felt true enough to close the loop on everything that had happened between us. I was never asking you to save my business. I told him, I just needed you to admit you were wrong. From being called worthless in my own diner to standing as co-owner of the entire block that once tried to erase me If you think I earned every bit of that ending, hit like right now, because this isn't the last story where someone underestimated the wrong woman. So subscribe and stay close, because the next one starts the second you're ready.